Hi there, I'm Alice Ferris. I'm here with Jim Anderson, and we are GoalBusters Consulting. And we are going to talk a little bit in this short video about picking the right technology to host your webinar. Now, before we go into the details of the technology options that you have, I want to encourage you to watch our other video, which is about 3 questions that you should ask yourself before you plan a webinar, because we want to make sure that you know, first of all, who your audience is, what you want their learning outcomes to be, number 2, and then, how can you actually deliver that content in a webinar format? If you can't answer those questions first, we don't want you to pick the technology, okay? So this is assuming that you know who your audience is, what they want to learn, and whether you can actually deliver that content in a virtual format. Then you can watch this video and learn about the various different webinar technology platforms that are out there.
When we say technology, we're not talking about the camera that you use or the microphone that you use or lights or even a green screen like I'm using. No, we're talking about the different platforms that you can use, the different types of technological delivery systems that you can use. That's what we're going to discuss in this video. And technology is changing rapidly, so there may be new options that could serve you better than those that we discuss here. But if you understand these basics, you'll be well served as you evaluate any other options. So let's take a look at a few of these different platforms.
Platform number 1 is a meeting platform. And these are designed for exactly what they're described as, meetings. So if this is a type of activity where you would have in real life brought together maybe 5, 10, at most 15 people to interact with one another in an environment, then you probably want to use a meeting platform. So the examples would be Zoom, Skype, GoToMeeting, Microsoft Teams, Google Hangouts. There's so many different options. But with the meeting platform, the good things about a meeting platform is that it's great for if you want to interact with your participants. So if you are intending to have a small group with high levels of interaction, a meeting platform will work very well for you. The other thing that's cool about this is a lot of them, almost all of them, in fact, have a free subscription package. So you have a way to do a shorter meeting with a smaller group of people for absolutely, for no cost on the surface. And the other thing is most people know how to use this. So we're all living in the Zoom world, right? So people know how to use Zoom. And you can use it to have the chats, to have the screen sharing, and for people to be able to interact with each other in an audio and video format. So those are the good things about a meeting platform.
Well, to Alice's point, everybody knows how to use these things. I would wager that most people that are viewing this video right now have used Zoom or some other similar platform in order to have family meetings. And if you think about it from a meeting perspective, again, that's what they're designed for. But that's kind of like the same thing you're doing when you're working with your colleagues. You're having weekly catch-up meetings or things like that. But you have to be careful, because if you get above a couple dozen people, it's going to get unwieldy. You're going to have problems with your bandwidth. I delivered a webinar recently in which we had an average of 250 people at any given time. It was set up as a meeting, and it was such a drain on the resources of the host. So you have to be careful. If you're going to have a larger number of people, a web meeting is not likely the best platform for you to use. When you're using these meetings, everyone that's a participant has all these options that they can look at. You've got audio options and video and screen sharing and chat and all that. It can become overwhelming for some who haven't used these things before. You have to recognize also that there are built-in registration option problems. If you want to have people to register for an event, there's not a lot that you can do in most meeting platforms. And if you don't set it up right, you run the risk of somebody hijacking your meeting. Yeah, you've heard the term, like you don't have enough to worry about, Zoom bombing. Somebody hijacks your meeting. So keep in mind, the purpose of the meeting, of a web meeting, an online meeting, is specifically just that. Now, you can take most of these programs and add a webinar add-on.
For instance, with Zoom, which is designed as a meeting platform, there is a module that you can add to a pro or higher account that is Zoom Webinar. You can do the same type of thing with Google Meet, where you can go through a third-party interface to be able to turn it into more of a webinar format. Or with Skype, there's a Microsoft add-on to be able to turn Skype into a more webinar-based format. So the good news about that is that, first of all, people already know how to use these platforms. So having to add on this little bit for webinar means that the basic interface is mostly the same. So people can figure it out. The other thing is, because it is, like I described, an add-on, usually the additional expense isn't too much up to a certain point. So that makes it pretty good for small to medium-sized webinars. So you can have a cost-effective method to go up to, for instance, for Zoom, up to about 100 participants in your webinar, which is a good-sized webinar. The other thing that's nice about these is most of them you can add on short-term. So like if you have a webinar coming up in the next month and you just want to add 1 month of Zoom webinar, you can do that. And you don't have to worry about it going on forever or trying to remember how to cancel it. And the other thing is, your participants, there's less of a risk of them taking control of your meeting because they have a different interface that isn't going to give them all the bells and whistles. So there's less of a risk of Zoom bombing, regardless of whether you're using Zoom webinar or Skype meeting or one of these other platforms.
You still have to keep in mind that size of group will impact whether or not this is something that can work for you. The webinar meetings, the webinar add-ons, they're good for groups maybe up to about 50, maybe 75 people. Once you get beyond that, you may need to look at a different platform. Also, registration options are still going to be limited. You still may need to use a separate registration program in order to make this work. And they can become expensive quickly. Zoom's free up to a point, just like every other software program or online service you've ever used. They hook you with the free services, and then when you realize that you can't do everything you want to do, they're going to charge you more. So be aware of those costs and evaluate whether you should be using that platform at all, or whether you might need to look at a different platform and maybe go straight to a webinar platform.
So there are specific platforms that are designed for webinars. And so I'm thinking about GoToWebinar, which was one of the first platforms to be able to do this. There's WebEx, there's Webinar Jam, there's Demio, there's Adobe Connect. There's probably 20 bazillion more that have been created that are specifically designed for webinars. And so the advantage that a webinar platform has for hosting a webinar is it's built to be a webinar. How many more times can I say webinar into one sentence? The other thing about it is that because they are built as webinars, they tend to have a cleaner interface because they understand that the presenter needs to see certain things and the participant needs to see certain things, and they don't have to have the same interface. So it tends to be a little cleaner, a little bit easier, and the technology that they have behind the webinar platforms means that they are more stable for larger audiences. So if you're talking about over 100 people participating in a webinar, you probably want to look at a technology delivery system that was built for webinars. The other thing that's cool about them is more often than not, they have some kind of built-in registration interface. So you don't have to worry about using Eventbrite or using some other way for people to register. People can register within the webinar platform. And the other cool thing about these is that they have analytics. They have analytics. They have the ability for you to check, did people actually watch this thing? When did I start losing people? You can see how many people participated, how many people signed on and then didn't participate. You can get all sorts of cool analytics built in. So that's the cool thing about these main platforms that are built for webinars. And one last thing is that there is a almost minuscule opportunity to Zoom bomb, because there's one interface for the presenters, another interface for the attendees, and you cannot get someone who has an attendee link to be able to take over your webinar. So those are the advantages of a true webinar platform.
But these things aren't always cheap. You have to make sure that you clearly understand just how many people that you're going to expect to be participating in this webinar, because the number of people that are participating will dictate what your overall cost is. Keep in mind that People have experience with Zoom for the most part, but they may not have experience with some of these other meeting platforms. Therefore, it can be confusing for those people who might be presenting for you if you're not presenting yourself. There is this concept of the satisfaction equation. When are people dissatisfied? When their experience doesn't meet their expectations. So if people think that they're just going to sign up and participate in a Zoom and you give them something else where other options are different or the buttons are moved to different locations, that will frustrate some people. So take that into consideration as you're deciding whether or not you will use one of these other platforms. And you may be limited as to how many people can actually be inputs to your webinar, to your stream. And by inputs, I mean how many speakers can you have on screen at once? Because that's different between different webinar platforms. Not all of them are unlimited, so understand that part as well. It's one of the reasons you might choose to just do a live stream. If you do a live stream, you could use Facebook Live or YouTube Live or Instagram Live, any of those things. Anybody's going to have access to it if they have the ability to have internet. They can watch this. They can participate in comments. Granted, you're going to want to make sure you have somebody monitoring comments either live, preferably, or after the fact. If you do it after the fact, you will not have the same level of engagement that you would if you have somebody monitoring those comments live. But there's no need for registration management. So if you're just interested in having product delivered, having content delivered, and you don't really care about registration, then maybe you just take it straight live. If you do want to use these platforms, they integrate well with Zoom. They integrate well with other meeting platforms. It's really simple, and it's practically free. In many cases, it is free.
Well, that is kind of true, that it is practically free. The other thing is you mentioned almost everyone can access your live feed. Well, that can be a con too of the, hey, everyone can look at it. So if you want to monetize this, if you want to make sure you're collecting information from registrations, you can't really do that with a live stream. You can get a sense of your gross number of people who are watching it, but for the most part, you don't have the ability to collect their information or get them to pay a registration fee. You, of course, could do it as a private live stream, but then you do have to run your registration separately on a different platform like Eventbrite or something like that. The other thing about your live stream is that bandwidth can be an issue. So that's one of the things that we've done with a couple of the organizations that we've worked with, where they didn't feel like they had enough bandwidth to be able to host a multi-person live stream. And so I had to do it in one case. So this is your opportunity to really assess whether you have the infrastructure at your home or at your office to be able to really manage all of those inputs and that signal to give people a high quality signal on the live stream, because people want it to look like television. They want it to look steady and a good quality feed. So we've talked about a lot of things in this video, but the bottom line is there are 4 different platforms that you can be using to deliver some type of online content. You can use a meeting platform like Zoom. You can use a webinar add-on that you add onto a meeting platform. You can do a platform that's specifically built to do webinars, or you can go straight to social media live, whether that's Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram. Those are your 4 different options. And there are definitely different technologies that we didn't even talk about today that usually will fall into one of those 4 categories. The other thing we want you to think about is don't just pick a delivery method because that's what you have or that's what you've done before. You want to pick a platform, a delivery platform that actually meets the needs of your webinar and your content and can effectively deliver it to your audience. The second thing is size matters. So if you're talking about a large audience, then you probably don't want to use a regular online meeting platform. You want to use something that's designed for a large audience. And then the last thing is just because it's online doesn't mean it's free. It's in some cases practically free, but you're probably going to need to pay something to deliver a quality product. So those are our thoughts on the different types of ways that you can deliver your online content. And if you have other questions that you would like us to address in the future, in future videos, or if you'd just like to reach out to us, please visit us at goalbusters.net. Thanks.